She arrived one day too late. But sometimes late is exactly when the story begins. The wind whispered across the empty plains as dust rolled low over Ethan Cole's ranch, a place so quiet even the boards of the porch seemed to forget the sound of footsteps, until hers broke the silence, slow, uneven, like each step had been borrowed from the last mile. Ethan stood in the doorway, hat pulled low, shadow cutting his face in half. The kind of man who hadn't expected company in years, not since. The letter came, not since the grave behind the house was still fresh enough to remember the shape of a name carved too soon. He didn't move when she reached the bottom step, didn't speak right away either, just watched, the way a man watches something he doesn't yet understand. Her dress was meant to be white once, maybe, but the road had taken its share, dust clung to the fabric, the hem torn just enough to tell a story she hadn't spoken yet. Her boots were wrong for a bride, worn thin at the soles, built for distance, not ceremony. And then there was the necklace, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in leather, resting just above her collarbone, catching the sun in a way that didn't belong to anything ordered from a catalog back east. She stopped a few feet from him, breathing shallow, like the air here might not be hers to take. "You're late," Ethan finally said, voice low, steady, not accusing, just stating something the land had already decided. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and, for a moment, there was something there, not shame, not exactly fear, something quieter, something that had learned how to survive without asking permission. "I know," she answered, her voice soft but not weak. The wind slipped between them again, carrying the scent of dry grass and old wood, and somewhere far off, a horse shifted against its reins, waiting for a command that hadn't come. Ethan's gaze dropped for just a second, not to her hands, not to the road behind her, but to that pendant, the way it rested against her skin like it belonged there more than anything else she wore. And in that second, something changed, subtle, like the shift before a storm no one else had noticed yet. He stepped aside, just enough to open the door behind him. "You're right on time for me," he said, and the words didn't sound like kindness. They sounded like a decision already made. She didn't move at first, like she was waiting for the rest of it, the part where he would ask questions, demand proof, turn her away, but it never came. Instead, the silence stretched, not empty, but full of everything neither of them said. She stepped forward, one foot, then the other, crossing the threshold into a place that smelled like leather, ash, and something older than both of them. Something like memory behind the house. The grave sat quiet under the sun, the name carved into it already beginning to fade at the edges. And inside, two strangers stood under the same roof, neither of them knowing that the road she had walked didn't end here. It had followed her, mile after mile, and now, just beyond the horizon, something was coming, not fast, not loud, but certain, like it had all the time in the world to arrive exactly when it needed. To the door, closed behind her with a sound that felt heavier than what should make, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that does not come from awkwardness, but from two people measuring the weight of what just happened. Ethan moved first, slow, deliberate, setting his hat on a nail by the door like he had done every day for years. The routine steady, even when everything else had shifted. She stood near the center of the room, not touching anything, not sitting, her eyes moving across the small cabin as if memorizing exits instead of furniture. The table worn smooth by time, a kettle resting cold on the stove, a chair slightly out of place like someone had left in a hurry and never came back. Her gaze lingered there a second longer than it should have, then moved on. "You can sit," Ethan said without looking at her, his voice carrying no pressure, just an offering. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair. Slowly, like she expected it to disappear beneath her. Her hands rested in her lap, but did not stay still, fingers brushing lightly against the edge of that turquoise pendant, as if checking it was still there. Outside, the wind shifted direction, pushing dust against the walls in soft waves, and somewhere far out past the ridge, a faint rhythm began to form, not loud, not close, but steady, like something moving with purpose. Ethan heard it, of course he did. A man like him always listened to what the land tried to say, but he did not turn toward the window, did not reach for the rifle resting above the door. Instead, he walked to the stove, poured water into the kettle, and struck a match, the small flame flickering to life with a quiet crack. "You traveled alone," he said after a moment. Not a question, just a piece of truth placed between them. She nodded once, then stopped, realizing he had not asked. "Mostly," she answered anyway, her voice careful, each word chosen like it mattered more than it should. Ethan did not press. He let the answer sit as it was, incomplete but enough. The kettle began to hum softly as the heat grew, filling the room with a faint warmth that pushed back against the dry air. She glanced toward the window again, this time faster, sharper, her shoulders tightening just enough to betray what she had been holding in. "They are still coming," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Ethan poured the water into 2 cups, the sound steady, grounding, then set one in front of her without a word. She stared at it for a second before wrapping her hands around the warmth, as if remembering what it felt like to hold something that did not demand anything in return. The rhythm outside grew clearer now, still distant but undeniable. More than one horse, more than a traveler passing through. Something organized, something patient. Ethan finally looked toward the window, not with alarm, but with the calm recognition of a man who had already decided where he would stand when the time came. "You did not come here by mistake," he said, turning back to her, his eyes settling on the pendant again, that small piece of turquoise catching the light like it carried more than color. She shook her head slowly, and for the first time, the truth slipped through without being shaped. "No," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "I came here because this was the only place left that might not turn me away." The words hung in the air, fragile but certain, and Ethan did not answer right away. He just stood there, measuring something deeper than her story, something in the way she held herself, in the way she had not asked for protection, only for space outside. The sound of hooves pressed closer against the horizon, and inside, the fire beneath the kettle burned steady, as if time itself had decided to slow down just enough for a choice to be made. Before anything else arrived, the sound reached the cabin before the riders did, a steady rhythm pressing against the land like it belonged there, like it had every right to come closer with each passing second, and Ayanna felt it in her chest before she heard it clearly, her fingers tightening around the warm cup until the heat no longer registered. Ethan set his own cup down untouched, his attention drifting toward the window without urgency. Just awareness, the kind that comes from years of listening more than speaking. "How many?" he asked quietly. Not looking at her, she swallowed, her eyes fixed on the door, as if it might open on its own. "Enough," she said, and that was all he needed. Outside, the horizon shifted from empty to occupied, shapes forming through dust and distance. First 3, then 5, then more behind them, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with a purpose that did not need to be announced. Ethan stepped to the wall and lifted his rifle down, not in a hurry, not with tension, just placing it in his hands like a man who knew the weight of choices more than the weight of metal. Ayanna watched him, something uncertain passing through her expression. "You should let me go," she said, the words quiet but firm. "This is not your trouble." Ethan glanced at her then, really looked this time, not at the dust on her dress or the miles in her boots, but the way she held herself, not begging, not pleading, just stating a truth she had lived long enough to understand. "It is already here," he answered, his voice even, and there was no argument in it, just fact. The hooves slowed outside, circling, measuring the space like they were reading the ground. Shadows crossing the window in long, deliberate movements. Ayanna stood now, the chair scraping softly against the floor, her hand rising to that pendant again. Not for comfort, but for certainty, like it reminded her who she was when everything else tried to strip it away. The first rider came into view through the glass, tall in the saddle, posture straight, eyes scanning without hurry, not searching for the house, but for her. And when his gaze found the window, he did not signal, did not call out. He simply stopped, and one by one, the others followed, forming a quiet line across the yard. No weapons raised, no voices carried, just presence, heavy and undeniable. Ethan stepped toward the door, his boots slow against the wood, each step deliberate, as if he had walked this moment before in another life. Ayanna moved closer too, not to hide, but not to step past him either. Something held her there, something she did not fully understand yet. He reached the door and paused, his hand resting on the handle, not opening it right away. "If they came for you," he said without turning, "they already know you are here," she nodded. Though he could not see it, "They always do," she replied, her voice steady now, not afraid, just resolved. Ethan opened the door then, the light spilling in across the floor, dust drifting through it like time had slowed to watch what came next. He stepped onto the porch alone, the rifle still low in his hand. Not aimed, not hidden, just there. The lead rider dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with a soft thud, his eyes never leaving Ayanna where she stood just inside the doorway. The wind lifted slightly, catching the edge of her dress, brushing the pendant into the light. And that was when everything changed. The man's gaze dropped to the turquoise stone, something unreadable passing across his face. Not anger, not relief, something deeper, something older. He took one step forward, then stopped, and in the silence that followed, he lowered himself down, one knee meeting the dirt, not as a threat, not as surrender, but as recognition, and behind him, without a word, the others did the same, one after another, until the yard was filled with still figures bowed in quiet respect. And Ethan did not move, did not speak, because whatever story had followed her here had just turned into something neither of them had expected. And for the first time since she arrived, Ayanna did not look at the horizon. She looked at him. No one spoke when the last rider lowered himself to one knee, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Not tense, not hostile, just deep, like the land itself was. Holding its breath, Ethan stood on the porch, the rifle still resting low in his hand, forgotten more than held, his eyes moving from one bowed figure to the next, measuring not danger, but meaning, because men do not kneel like that without reason. And whatever reason stood behind them was now standing inside his doorway. Ayanna did not move at first, her body still as stone, her fingers no longer gripping the pendant, but resting against it, as if it had already done what it needed to do. The wind shifted again, softer now, brushing across the yard and stirring the edges of dust around the kneeling men, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and distance. The lead rider remained still, head slightly lowered, waiting, not demanding, not rushing, just waiting for something that had not yet been given. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder then, not fully turning, just enough to see her standing in the shadow of the doorway. Her eyes no longer scanning for escape, but fixed on the scene before her like she was seeing something she had not expected to survive long enough to witness. "They're not here to take you," Ethan said quietly, not as a question, not as reassurance, just stating what the moment had already made clear. Ayanna stepped forward then, one slow step that carried her out of the shadow and into the light, the sun catching the turquoise stone at her throat and sending a small flash across the yard. And that was when the lead rider lifted his head fully, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation. There was no fear in them, no anger, only recognition, something older than either of them, something that did not need to be explained. She stopped at the edge of the porch, just behind Ethan's shoulder, close enough to feel the steadiness in the way he stood, not shielding her, not stepping aside, just present, the kind of presence that does not ask for trust, but earns it without words. The man in front spoke then, his voice calm, measured, each word placed carefully into the silence. "You carry what was thought lost," he said, his gaze lowering briefly to the pendant before returning to her face. Ayanna's breath caught for just a second, not from fear, but from the weight of being seen for what she truly was, not a runaway, not a stranger, but something far more complicated, something that had been hidden even from herself for too long. She did not answer right away, and no one pressed her to, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to urgency, it belonged to truth. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, the porch creaking under his boots, a small sound that reminded him he was still part of this world, even if he did not yet understand his place in it. "She came here because she had nowhere else," he said, his voice steady, Not defending, not claiming, just offering a piece of the story that mattered. The lead writer nodded once, a small motion that carried more acknowledgement than agreement, and she arrived exactly where she was meant to, he replied, the words settling into the space between them like something that had been waiting to be spoken long before any of them arrived. Ayanna finally lifted her hand, her fingers, brushing lightly against the pendant, then lowering again as she looked from the kneeling men to Ethan. Something shifting in her expression, not uncertainty, not fear, but the beginning of understanding, because whatever path had led her here had not ended at this door. It had only just begun to reveal itself. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was running from something. She felt like she had stepped into something she could not turn away from. And Ethan, standing beside her, without moving, realized that whatever this was, it was not passing through. It was staying, settling into the quiet space he had once thought would never belong to anyone, but him. The air did not move for a long moment after the words settled, as if even the wind understood that something fragile had just been placed between them, something that could not be rushed or forced. Ethan remained where he stood, one step ahead of Ayanna, not shielding her, not presenting her, just existing in that quiet space that now belonged to more than one life. The men in the yard did not rise, did not shift. Their stillness was not submission, but respect, the kind that waits without demand. Ayanna stepped forward, then past the line where shadow met sunlight, her boots pressing into the dry wood of the porch with a sound that felt louder than it should. Every eye followed her, not sharply, not with suspicion, but with a steady attention that did not waver. She stopped beside Ethan, not behind him anymore, and for the first time since she arrived, her shoulders lowered just slightly, like a weight she had been carrying for miles had finally found somewhere to rest. "I did not know it would bring you here," she said, her voice quiet but clear, the words directed at the man in front, but meant for all of them. The lead writer lifted his gaze fully, meeting hers with something that looked almost like relief, but deeper, more grounded. "It did not bring us," he answered, his voice calm, steady as the land itself. "It called us back." The words lingered, settling into the space like a truth that had been waiting longer than any of them. Ethan felt that shift more than he understood it. His hand loosened slightly around the rifle, not lowering it, not raising it, just no longer holding it with purpose, because whatever this moment was, it was not asking for defense, it was asking for witness. Ayanna's fingers brushed the pendant again, but this time not out of habit or fear. She held it lightly, as if recognizing it for what it truly was, not something she carried, but something that had carried her. "I found it by the river," she said, her voice softer now, more certain. "I thought it was just a piece of stone." A faint breath passed through the group, not a sound, not quite movement, just a shared understanding that something had come full circle. The man in front nodded once, slow, deliberate. "It belonged to someone who chose to protect rather than turn away," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan before returning to her. "That choice does not fade with time." Ethan did not respond, but something in his posture shifted, not pride, not discomfort, just a quiet acknowledgement that choices, once made, do not stay buried where they are left. Ayanna looked at him then, really looked this time, as if seeing past the silence he carried, past the distance he kept, between himself and the world. And for a moment, the two of them stood there not as strangers brought together by circumstance, but as two people who had stepped into something neither had planned, but neither could walk away from. Outside, the men remained still, waiting not for instruction, but for her. The weight of that realization settled into her slowly, not overwhelming, just undeniable. She took another step forward, moving past Ethan this time, down the first board of the porch, her boots touching the edge where would met dust, the line between two worlds, and she did not hesitate. She stepped down into the yard, the ground firm beneath her feet, the sun warm against her face, the pendant catching the light again as she moved, and as she stood there among them, no longer running, no longer hiding, the silence shifted once more, not heavy now, not uncertain, but steady, like something had finally found where it belonged. And behind her, Ethan did not call her back, did not step forward to follow. He simply watched, knowing without needing to say it that whatever had arrived at his door was not leaving the same way it came. The ground felt different beneath her boots now. Not softer, not easier, just steady in a way she had not known in a long time. And the men around her did not rise until she stopped moving. As if her steps had been the only signal they were waiting for, the lead rider stood slowly, not breaking the quiet, just shifting it, his height matching. The stillness in his presence, his eyes remained on her, not searching, not questioning, simply recognizing. "You were not meant to carry it alone," he said, his voice low but certain. Ayanna did not answer right. Away. Her gaze moved across the faces around her, each one marked by distance and time, but none of them unfamiliar in the way strangers usually are. There was something in the way they stood, in the way they held silence, that felt like memory without detail, like something she had known once and forgotten only because she had been forced to. Behind her, the porch creaked softly as Ethan shifted his weight, not stepping down, not stepping away, just remaining where the line between his world and hers had been drawn, and now blurred. The wind moved again, carrying dust across the yard in thin, restless lines, but no longer felt like something chasing her. It felt like something passing through. "Why now?" she asked finally, her voice steady but quieter than before, not out of fear, but out of respect for what she did not yet understand. The man in front of her tilted his head slightly, considering not the question, but the timing of it. "Because you stopped running," he said. And the simplicity of it landed heavier than any explanation could have. Ayanna felt that truth settle in her chest. Not sharp, not sudden, but deep, like something she had always known but never allowed herself to face. Her fingers lifted once more to the pendant, but this time she did not hold it. She let it rest where it belonged, as if it no longer needed her to prove anything. Ethan watched from the porch, his eyes moving between her and the man in front of her, and for the first time he saw not a stranger standing in his yard, but a connection he had not asked for, one that had arrived without warning and refused to leave quietly. She said she had nowhere else. Ethan spoke then, his voice carrying across the space, not loud, but clear enough to be heard. The men turned their attention to him, not with challenge, not with curiosity, just with the same calm awareness they had given her. The lead rider nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not break the balance of the moment. "Then this is where she begins," he replied, and the words did not sound like permission. They sounded like recognition. Ayanna turned back toward Ethan then. Her expression changed in a way that was hard to name. Not gratitude, not relief, something quieter, something more lasting, because he had not asked her to explain, had not asked her to prove. He had simply opened the door, and that had been enough. The men began to rise one by one, not in unison, not as a command, but as a natural shift, like the end of something that had already reached its purpose. No one rushed forward. No one stepped closer than necessary. They gave her space, not because they feared her, but because they understood what it meant to arrive somewhere and not yet know how to stay. The lead rider stepped back slightly, creating distance without leaving. "We will not take you from here," he said, his eyes steady. "Not unless you choose to come." Ayanna breathed in slowly, the air filling her chest without resistance for the first time since she could remember. She looked at the land around her, the open stretch of sky, the worn wood of the porch, the man still standing there who had not moved since. She stepped into the yard, and she understood then that this place was not where her journey ended, but where it finally made sense. And Ethan, watching her without speaking, realized that whatever had crossed his threshold had not come to pass through. It had come to stay, and he did not turn away from it. The yard did not empty when the men rose. It simply changed shape, like a river shifting course without losing its depth. And Ayanna stood at the center of it, not surrounded, not claimed, just present, her boots pressed firm into the dust, as if the ground itself had decided to hold her there for a while. The lead rider stepped back another pace, not retreating, just allowing space to grow where tension had once been, and the others followed that unspoken rhythm, moving their horses with quiet hands, reins loose, eyes still watching but no longer searching. Ethan remained on the porch, his figure steady against the doorway. The rifle, now resting against the frame beside him. Forgotten in a way that meant more than if he had held it tight. He had not stepped forward, but he had not stepped away either. And that was the difference. Ayanna turned slowly, taking in the space that had formed. Between her and the riders, between her and the cabin, between what had been chasing her and what now stood still. And for the first time, the silence did not feel like something waiting to break. It felt like something holding, something steady enough to stand inside. "If I stay," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach both the porch and the yard. Not asking, not declaring, just placing the thought into the air where it could be seen clearly. The lead rider nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Then you stay," he answered, as if there had never been another option. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly at that, not in surprise, but in recognition of something simple and undeniable, the kind of truth that does not need to be explained twice. Ayanna let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized, her shoulders lowering another inch, the weight easing not because it had been taken from her, but because she had chosen where to set it down. The wind moved. Again, softer now, carrying the faint creak of saddle leather, the quiet snort of a horse, the small, ordinary sounds that return when something extraordinary has passed without breaking anything. She turned toward the porch then, her steps slow, deliberate, not uncertain, but careful in a way that respected what had just unfolded. Each board under her boots sounded different now, less hollow, more grounded, as if the house itself had changed in the same quiet way she had. Ethan did not move to meet her. He simply watched, his eyes steady, taking in not the mile she had walked, but the moment she had stepped into. And when she reached the bottom step, she paused, not because she needed permission, but because she understood the line she was crossing, not from outside to inside, but from one life into another. "You did not ask me to leave," she said, her voice softer now, meant only for him. Ethan shook his head once, a small motion that carried no hesitation. "You did not ask to stay," he replied, and the balance of it settled between them. Even, fair, complete in a way neither of them had expected. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then stepped up onto the porch, the wood steady. Beneath her feet, the doorway opened behind him just as it had been when she first arrived, but it did not feel the same. Nothing did. Behind her, the riders had begun to turn their horses, not all at once, not in formation, just one by one, as if each man understood that what they had come for had been found, not taken, and that was enough. The lead rider lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting Ayanna's one last time, not to confirm, not to question, just to acknowledge. Then he turned well, guiding his horse with a light touch, and the line that had filled the yard slowly dissolved back into the open land, leaving behind nothing but tracks that would fade with the next wind. Ayanna stood at the threshold, half in shadow, half in light. And for the first time since she had reached the end of her road, she did not look back at where she had come from. She looked forward into a place that had not asked for her, but had not turned her away, and Ethan, standing beside her, without speaking, understood that sometimes the quietest choices were the ones that changed everything. The dust settled slowly after the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge, not all at once, but in quiet layers, like the land itself was returning to something familiar, something older than the moment that had just passed. Ayanna stood in the doorway, the sunlight stretching across the floor behind her, her shadow long and still, and for a while she did not move, as if stepping fully inside would make everything that had just happened feel too real. Ethan reached past her without a word and pushed the door gently until it closed with a soft, steady sound. Not final, not forceful, just enough to mark the shift from outside to in. The room felt different now. Not larger, not smaller, just shared, the air carrying the faint warmth of the fire he had lit earlier, the kettle still resting on the stove, forgotten but not abandoned. Ayanna walked slowly to the table, her fingers brushing lightly across the wood, tracing lines worn by years she had not been part of. She did not sit right away. Instead, she looked around, taking in the details she had not noticed before, the way the light came through the window at an angle, the small marks along the wall where something had once hung, the chair that still sat slightly out of place. She stopped there, Her gaze lingering. "Someone sat there," she said quietly, not asking, not accusing, just recognizing. Ethan followed her gaze, his expression unchanged but his eyes settling for a moment on that same spot. "Yes," he answered, nothing more. The word carrying enough weight to fill the space between them. Ayana nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something she did not fully understand but did not need explained. She moved past the chair and finally sat, her posture relaxed but not loose, like someone who had learned how to rest without letting go completely. Ethan stepped to the window, his eyes scanning the distance not for riders, but for what remained after them, the tracks already beginning to fade under the shifting wind. The land reclaiming its own story without keeping record. "They will not come back," he said after a moment, not as reassurance, but as observation. Ayana looked down at her hands, resting still in her lap, the pendant lying quiet against her chest, no longer catching the light the same way. "They do not need to," she replied, and there was something different in her voice now. Something settled, something certain. Ethan turned slightly, leaning his shoulder against the frame, watching her not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet attention that did not press. "Then why did they come?" he asked, not because he needed the answer, but because the question belonged there. Ayana lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time, she did not look like someone who had been chased to the end of the world. She looked like someone who had arrived exactly where she needed to be. "To make sure I stopped running," she said, her voice steady, the words simple but complete. The fire beneath the kettle flickered softly, the small flame reflecting in the metal surface, moving but never leaving its place. Ethan nodded once, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just acknowledging that some things do not need to be explained further. The silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It did not press against them. It rested around them, like something that belonged. Ayana leaned back slightly in the chair, her shoulders easing another fraction, her eyes drifting toward the window where the horizon stretched wide and open. No longer something she had to escape, but something she could choose to stay within. And Ethan, standing there without moving, realized that the quiet he had built for himself over the years had not been broken. It had been changed, and somehow it felt stronger for it. Not because it was still his, but because it was no longer empty. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came slowly, like light remembering its way back across the land. And Ayana woke before it fully reached the window, not from habit, not from fear, but from something quieter, something that no longer needed to be chased away. The room held a stillness that felt different now. Not empty, not waiting, just present. She sat up slowly in the chair where she had rested, her hand instinctively rising to the pendant before she stopped herself, letting it rest where it belonged. The fire had burned low in the night, leaving only a faint warmth in the air, enough to remind her she had not been alone. Ethan was already awake, standing near the doorway, his hat in his hands, not yet on his head, as if he had paused before stepping into the day. He glanced at her once, then toward the window. "Sun is coming up," he said, his voice low, steady, like everything else about him. Ayana nodded, pushing herself to her feet, her movements slower now. Not because she was tired, but because she was no longer rushing toward anything. She walked to the window and looked out, the horizon stretching wide, untouched except for the faint traces of tracks that were already fading into the earth. The land did not hold on to what passed through it. It let go, and somehow that felt right. "It looks different," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Ethan stepped closer, stopping just behind her, not too near, not distant, just enough to share the same view. "It is the same," he replied. "You are not." The words settled into her without resistance, not as a correction, but as a recognition. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing as the light grew stronger, touching the edges of everything inside the room, making the worn wood look softer, the small details clearer, the chair no longer out of place, the table no longer just something to pass by. She turned from the window and moved toward the door, her hand resting briefly on the frame before she stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of open land and something new she could not yet name. Ethan followed a moment later, settling his hat onto his head as he stepped onto the porch. the boards creaking softly beneath his weight. Ayanna walked a few steps into the yard, her boots pressing into the ground that no longer felt like something she needed to leave behind. She stopped near where the riders had stood, the faint marks of their presence still visible, not erased, just fading. They said I could go with them, she said without turning, her voice calm. Ethan leaned against the porch, poised his gaze on her, not surprised, not concerned, just listening. They said you could choose, he answered, the difference quiet but clear. Ayanna nodded slightly, her fingers brushing the air at her side. Not reaching for the pendant this time. I've been choosing without knowing it, she said, every mile, every step. She turned then, looking back at the cabin, at the man who had opened the door without asking for anything in return. But this is the first time it feels like I am not choosing to escape. The words hung between them, simple, steady, and Ethan did not rush to fill the silence that followed. He just watched her, the way he had from the beginning, not trying to understand everything, just understanding enough. Ayanna took a slow step back toward the porch, then another, not uncertain, not hesitant, just deliberate, like each movement mattered now in a way it had not before. And when she reached the bottom step, she paused, looking up at him, not as a stranger, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had found a place to stand. If I stay, she said softly, it will not be because I cannot leave. Ethan met her gaze, his expression unchanged but his eyes steady, grounded. Then stay because you want to, he replied, and there was nothing else in it, no promise, no condition, just the space for her to decide. And for the first time in a long time, Ayanna did not look at the horizon. She looked at the door, and then she stepped forward. The door did not feel like a boundary anymore when she crossed it. It felt like a choice, and Ayanna stepped inside without hesitation this time. Her boots steady against the wood, her breath even, as if the weight she had carried across miles had finally found a place to rest without needing to be set down completely. Ethan moved aside just enough to give her space, not out of habit, but out of respect for the way she entered, not like someone seeking shelter, but like someone deciding where to stand. The morning light followed her in, stretching across the floor, touching the edges of the table, the chair, the walls that had once held only one life, and now quietly held two. She walked to the table again, but this time she did not pause to study it. She pulled the chair into place and sat, not carefully, not cautiously, just naturally, as if the room had already begun to recognize her. Ethan watched her for a moment, then reached for the kettle, lifting it from the stove and pouring what remained into 2 cups, the sound soft, familiar, grounding. He set one in front of her again, the same gesture as before, but it did not carry the same meaning. It was no longer an offering to a stranger. It was something simpler, something steadier. She wrapped her hand around the cup, the warmth settling into her fingers without surprise. You always start the day like this, she said, not asking, just noticing. Ethan nodded once, taking a seat across from her, the chair scraping lightly against the floor. Most days, he answered, his voice even, as if there was nothing remarkable about routine, and maybe there was not, except when it was shared. Ayanna looked down at the surface of the cup, the faint reflection shifting with the light. I have not had many days that felt the same, she said quietly, not with regret, not with complaint, just truth. Ethan did not respond right away. He let the words settle, the way he let most things settle before deciding what they meant. Outside, the land stretched wide and open, unchanged in its shape, but different in its silence. The absence of riders no longer felt like relief. It felt like completion. Something had come and gone without taking anything with it, and that mattered more than he expected. Then maybe that changes, he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, not offering comfort, just possibility. Ayanna lifted her gaze to meet his, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before. Not uncertainty, not caution, but presence, the kind that does not look for exits. She took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, her shoulders settling into a place they had not known for a long time. Maybe it already has, she replied, and the words did not need to be stronger than that. They did not need to promise anything. They simply marked where she stood. The room held that moment quietly, the small Sounds of the day beginning outside, drifting in through the window. The creak of wood, the faint movement of wind, the kind of sounds that do not demand attention but fill the spaces where something new is taking shape. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving briefly to the door, then back to her. Not checking, not expecting anyone to arrive, just acknowledging that the world outside still existed, even if it no longer pressed against this place the way it had before. Ayanna followed his glance for a second, then returned her focus to him. "You did not ask my name," she said, a faint trace of curiosity in her voice. Not sharp, just present. Ethan held her gaze, the corner of something unspoken passing through his expression. "You did not offer it," he answered, and there was no distance in the words, just balance. She nodded slowly, as if that made more sense than anything else could have. "Ayanna," she said then, her voice steady, the name settling into the room, like it belonged there. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without repeating it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. "Ethan," he replied, simple, direct, and for a moment, that was enough. Two names in a quiet room, not tied to the past, not pulled by the road, just present. And as the light grew stronger across the floor, touching everything it reached, it became clear that whatever had begun here was not marked by arrival or departure, but by the choice to remain, one moment at a time. Without needing to know what came next, the name lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had been spoken, without weight, without history pressing behind it. And Ayanna felt that in a way she had not felt her own name in years, as if it had finally found a place where it did not need to explain itself. Ethan reached for his cup again, taking a slow sip, his movement steady, unchanged, but something in the air had shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to break the quiet, just enough to deepen it. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, its light stronger now, reaching further into the room, touching corners that had stayed dim before, revealing small details that had always been there, but had not been seen. The grain of the wood along the table, the faint scratches near the edge where hands had rested too long, the slight unevenness in the floor where time had pressed its mark. Ayanna noticed these things now, not as someone passing through, but as someone beginning to belong. She set her cup down gently, the soft sound grounding her in the moment. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice calm, not urgent, not uncertain, just present. Ethan did not answer immediately. He leaned back slightly, his gaze moving toward the window again, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging the world beyond the walls. "Same as before," he said finally, his tone even. "Work needs doing. Land does not wait." The simplicity of it settled between them, not disappointing, not overwhelming, just clear. Ayanna nodded slowly, as if she had expected something more complicated, something that would define what came next, but instead found something steadier, something that did not need to be explained. She stood from the chair, her movements deliberate, her posture no longer guarded, and walked toward the door again, not with hesitation, but with intention. Ethan watched her, not stopping her, not following, just letting the moment unfold the way it needed to. She stepped onto the porch once more, the sunlight meeting her fully this time, no shadow holding her back, the air warmer now, carrying the quiet sounds of the day beginning in earnest. She looked out across the land, her eyes tracing the line where the horizon met the sky. But this time, she was not measuring distance, she was measuring space, the kind that allowed her to stand still without feeling trapped. Ethan stepped out beside her after a moment, his presence steady, familiar now in a way that did not need to be named. They stood there without speaking, the silence between them no longer something to fill, but something to share. "There is water down the ridge," he said after a while, nodding toward a path that cut faintly through the land. "Fence line needs checking too." Ayanna followed his gaze, taking in the direction, the distance, the quiet expectation in the way he spoke, not telling her what to do, not asking, just offering what the day held. She nodded once, understanding without needing more. "Then we start there," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no sense of obligation, just choice. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting that as easily as he had accepted her presence. And for a moment, nothing else was needed. The past did not press forward, the future did not demand. Shape, there was only the work ahead, the land beneath them, and the quiet understanding that had formed between two people who had not planned to meet, but had chosen not to walk away. Ayanna took a step off the porch, her boots meeting the ground with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with running, and everything to do with staying. Ethan followed a moment later, not leading, not trailing, just walking beside her as they moved toward the open land. The distance ahead no longer. Something to cross, but something to live within. And as they walked, the quiet stretched with them. Not empty, not waiting, but full in a way that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The path down the ridge was narrower than it looked from the porch, a faint line pressed into the earth by years of quiet use. And Ayanna followed it without asking where it led, her steps steady, her pace matching Ethan's without effort. The land open around them in long stretches of dry grass and scattered stone, the kind of place that did not hide anything but still managed to feel vast. The wind moved low across the ground, brushing against their boots, carrying the soft scent of water somewhere ahead. Not strong, not close, but certain. Ethan walked with the ease of someone who knew each turn without needing to look, his gaze forward, his attention spread across the small details that others might miss. A shift in the grass, a change in the ground, the quiet language of a place that had shaped him over time. Ayanna noticed it, not as something to question, but as something to learn, her eyes moving across the land the way his did, not searching for escape anymore, but understanding. They walked in. Silence for a while. Not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said, the rhythm of their steps settling into something shared, something unspoken but clear. After a few minutes, the ground dipped slightly, the air cooler here, and the faint sound of water reached them, soft, steady, like a promise kept without needing to be announced. Ayanna slowed as the stream came into view, a narrow line cutting through the earth. The surface catching the light in small, shifting patterns. She stepped closer, crouching near the edge, her hand hovering above the water before finally touching it. The coolness immediate, grounding, real in a way that did not need explanation. She let her fingers rest there for a moment, watching the way the current moved around them without resistance, then pulled her hand back slowly. Ethan stood a few feet away, watching not her but the space around her, giving her the quiet she needed to take in the moment. "It does not stop," she said after a while, her voice low, thoughtful. Ethan nodded once. "It moves, even when everything else feels still," he replied, and the meaning settled between them without needing to be expanded. Ayanna stood. Again, brushing her hands lightly against her dress, not to clean them, but to return herself to the moment. Her gaze followed the line of the stream as it curved away, disappearing into the distance, and for a second, something old stirred, the instinct to follow, to keep moving, to see where it led, but it passed just as quickly, replaced by something steadier, something rooted. She turned back toward Ethan, her expression calm, her eyes clear. "We checked the fence," she said, not asking, just continuing. Ethan gave a small nod, already turning to lead the way along the line that marked the edge of his land. The post stood at intervals, worn but strong, the wire stretched between them holding its shape against time and weather. They walked side by side now, not in silence, but in something deeper, a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken to be real. Ayanna reached out once, her fingers brushing lightly against the wire, feeling the tension, the strength in something that held without breaking, and she understood then that staying was not about being still. It was about holding, about choosing to remain even when the world continued to move around you. Ethan stopped near one of the posts, checking the line with practiced hands, adjusting what needed it, leaving what did not. Ayanna watched him for a moment, then stepped in beside him, her movements slower but certain, mirroring what she saw. Not perfectly, not yet, but with intention. And as they worked, the sun climbed higher, the light stronger, the day unfolding without hurry, without demand, just as it was meant to. And for the first time in a long time, Ayana did not measure the distance ahead or the road behind. She measured the moment in front of her, the ground beneath her feet, the quiet presence beside her, and it was enough the sun had climbed high enough to wash the land to steady. Even light by the time they reached the last post along the ridge, and neither of them hurried the final steps. Not because there was more to do, but because there was no need to rush what had already settled into place. Ethan ran his hand once more along the wire, checking its hold, then let it rest, the small motion marking the end of something simple, something necessary. Ayana stood beside him, her fingers brushing lightly against the wood of the post, feeling the rough surface beneath her skin, grounding herself in a way that no distance ever had. The wind moved across the ridge again, carrying the quiet sound of the stream behind them, the soft whisper of grass bending and returning, the kind of sound that does not call attention to itself, but reminds you it is always there. She looked out across the open land, the horizon stretching wide and unbroken, and for a moment she thought of the miles she had crossed, the nights spent moving without rest, the constant pull to keep going, to stay ahead of something she could not name, and it felt distant now, not gone, but no longer holding its place at the center of her steps. Ethan leaned against the post for a second, his gaze following the same line, not searching, not measuring, just seeing. "Fence will hold," he said quietly, more to the land than to her. Ayana nodded, her eyes still on the distance. "So will I," she replied, and the words did not carry weight. They carried certainty, not loud, not forced, just steady. Ethan glanced at her then, not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging what had already been decided. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything that did not need to be spoken. The understanding that had grown between them without demand, without promise, simply through presence. Ayana turned back toward the path, her steps unhurried, not because there was nowhere to go, but because she no longer needed to go anywhere else. Ethan pushed off the post and walked beside her, their pace matching without effort, the ridge falling away behind them as they moved toward the cabin, the structure small against the wide land but steady, unchanged in shape, changed in meaning, the door still open, just as they had left it, not as an invitation, not as a test, just as it was. She stepped onto the porch first this time, her boots finding the boards with quiet familiarity, and paused only long enough to take in the space before stepping inside. Ethan followed a moment later, the sound of his boots steady behind her, the room holding the same quiet it always had. But now it felt different. Not because something had been added, but because something had been shared. Ayana moved to the table again, not out of habit, but because it felt like the right place to stand, her hand resting lightly on the surface, the wood warm from the light that had filled the room all morning. She looked toward the window, the horizon still there, still wide, still open, but it no longer pulled at her. It simply existed. Ethan set his hat down on the same nail by the door, the motion familiar, unchanged, and in that small repetition, something settled completely. The past did not disappear, the road did not vanish, but they no longer defined the space she stood in. The quiet returned once more, deep and steady, and in that quiet, no one needed to say that she had arrived. No one needed to name what this place had become, because out here, some things did not need words. They only needed a person willing to stay and another willing to let them.